PokeClass is sponsored by CollectorsCash.com, your #1 online store for all you need for the Pokemon trading card game. They have all the top competitive and collector's cards on the market at prices you won't find lower anywhere else. Whether you're after tins and packs from the current format, or just looking for those hard to get primes to finish off your deck, Collector's Cash is your place to go. Make sure you check them out at www.collectorscash.com. Welcome to PokeClass episode 40, where we're going to be taking a look at a type of deck which has dropped in play quite dramatically in the Heart Gold Soul Silver onwards format. A particular card in question was one half of a deck that went on to win various cities, states and even UK nationals, and is still around, but not being played quite as much, Vileplume Undaunted. It's kind of ironic that the 1 year anniversary of PokeClass is going to be centred around a card that was covered all the way back in episode 2, but we can see it in a completely different light now. Let's talk about Trainer Lock. So the concept of lock decks came across as quite the bad idea when it came to the early rotation, since there really weren't any obvious cards to choose from to create an effective lock that the opponent couldn't escape from. Fast forward to now, and the small amount of competitive play we've seen already has unearthed some pretty nice versions of lock decks based around Vileplume, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Vileplume should be pretty familiar to pretty much every single player, since it's a prominent part of last format in the deck Vilegar. But why should we still be very wary of this card? Well, this card, as you know, blocks both players from playing trainer cards from their hand, and in the past, this was powerful but much easier to get around than it was now. Playing cards such as Bebe's Search over Pokemon Communication was better against Vileplume, since it could take out the trainers from the hand and still search for those important Pokemon you needed for setup. However, now we don't really have any kind of powerful search supporter like that. So what do? Most decks right now run off a high amount of trainers, including Pokemon Reversal, Pokemon Communication, Switch, Rare Candy, and Plus Power, just to name a few, and Vileplume blocks all use of these while it's in play, meaning that pretty much every other deck in the top tier has around half of its deck rendered useless while Vileplume's on the field. This card hitting the field early on in the game could really hurt the opponent's chances of getting anything set up, and even with this kind of power, Vileplume really hasn't seen this much play at all, up until recently, where it really has outperformed the competition. Let's have a look at how you can build Vileplume in various different ways to make very effective lock decks. As mentioned in the last episode, we saw a deck featuring Vileplume hit second place at Worlds 2011, piloted by Ross Cawthon of the United States. His deck was one that really couldn't have been expected at all, and featured Reuniclus, Zekrom, Blissey, and a few other Pokemon to go with the Trainer Lock strategy. What this kind of deck focuses on is getting the Trainer Lock as soon as turn 2, by using cards such as Pichu and Pokemon Collector to fill out the bench with weak Pokemon such as Solosis and Oddish, ready for evolution straight away the next turn. These weak basics must be put onto the bench as soon as possible, in multiple numbers, since they can be picked off quite easily. This is why Pichu was the best way to get 2 copies of each out at the same time. This is probably one of Vileplume's weakest points in the current format. Oddish has just only 40 HP, which is a key target for Yanmega's linear attack as soon as turn 2, meaning that your chances of getting that Vileplume out early are shattered if you only have one to put down at a time. The best way to approach a game when playing Vileplume is to either have a way to get through 2 benched Oddish, or observe the field closely and wait for that crucial drop of a single Oddish onto the bench, where it won't get linear attacked or knocked out by any other means. The latter is much harder to do, but decks including Vileplume right now are very difficult to pilot and will take some testing to get right. Ross's list really isn't a private matter anymore, so here it is. As you can see, there are a lot of controversial decisions in here. My main worry is that there isn't enough early game hand refresh in there, and my version plays a little bit differently, probably because of my lack of Tropical Beach. However, the main strategy can be plucked from this list, and I've cut it down into a skeleton form for you here. The skeleton provided to my right gives you 16 free spaces, which sounds like quite a lot, but it's really only going to cater for your main attacker and support for that Pokemon, and here's a few of those options that sway slightly from the Donphan and Zekrom main attackers. First up, we have Samurott. This card has an ability which is exactly the same as Donphan Prime, and covers that water type weakness that Suicune Entei Legend did in the original list. Now this card has a complete colourless attack cost, so it won't need a whole change in energy lines, and it will stay on the field for a couple of turns, with that ability blocking quite a bit of the damage. If you are comparing this to Donphan, Donphan is actually the better choice for this deck, since it adds damage to your own bench for manipulation with Reuniclus. But if you don't have access to Donphans, then this Pokemon isn't too bad for a replacement. Against anything that isn't lightning, this Pokemon is going to be able to take a few hits, which frees you up to move the damage around as freely as you like to avoid the KOs while Samurott keeps on attacking. When playing this version, you must be wary that it has a dreaded lightning weakness, making your Magnezone matchup quite difficult, because they can effectively one-hit KO you every turn with Lost Burn. But do try this out as an option, as Samurott is quite the underdog in this format. This next option is going to be a very fun one to play, and comes in the form of Warlord from Triumphant. Now this guy has a huge 180 HP, which is going to be hard for anyone to KO, and it's a stage 1 Pokemon as well, making for a faster and more efficient setup under Train Lock, since you won't need to use Rare Candy. What Warlord benefits from is the same as Samurott. It can take quite a decent hit, which means you'll be moving that damage around to avoid KOs as freely as you like with Reuniclus. The attacks on this one aren't as good as Samurott's, since the energy line will need to be altered slightly and will take a bit longer to set up, but maybe Warlord could just be used as a tech to pile damage onto, who knows. The final viable attacker for this kind of deck is Machamp Prime. This guy's attack Champ Buster takes full advantage of damage being on the bench, and with a massive 150 HP of its own, it will also be able to take quite the hit, while Reuniclus moves that damage around. The attack does take quite a few turns to set up, but with the right early game attacker, Machamp could be that big hitter you're looking for to sweep the rest of the field, doing 150 damage to whatever's in the opposing active spot. Machamp also has a really nice type advantage for the current format, and is one of the few fighting types that can take down a Yanmega Prime in one hit without the aid of plus powers. This could also be a fun one to try out. Overall, I don't think we've seen the last of this deck mechanic after Worlds. The damage manipulation strategy actually has a ton of options when you look at which attackers can take full advantage of damage being on your side of the field, and we could well see some more variants of this when we hit the battle roads. The next form of lock has slipped quite far under the radar since it was first used at Canadian Nationals, but some of the top players have started to take it under their wing and go for their versions of it with a very interesting result. I'm speaking mainly from footage taken by the Top Cut at the Top Cut Invitational Tournament event held after Worlds, where two-time world champion Jason Klaczynski won with a variation of Mew, Muck and Vileplume. His version makes for a lot of hate on decks such as Reshiram Typhlosion and Omega Magnezone, since the deck is designed to control the opponent's energy drops while locking their big retreat Pokemon into the active spot with Muck's Sludge Drag attack. Jason's list is not public knowledge at the moment, so here's a skeleton list I put together for the deck. Now this deck goes for a slightly different engine to get that Vileplume into play, by searching out the pieces with Sunflora's Poker Power and setting up from there after you've blocked one of your opponent's heavy retreaters with Sludge Drag via Mew. The deck's opening turns focus on benching that Oddish early on, possibly with a Sunkern, and get that Muck Lost Zone through the use of Mew's See-Off attack. This sets you up for evolving and searching out those grass Pokemon as soon as possible while being able to attack with Muck. An interesting inclusion into this deck includes Apon from Triumphant, which is actually the final piece of this complex lock. While your opponent is sat there with an energyless 2 retreat cost or more Pokemon in the active spot, with no trainers to help them out, the only way they can start to set up is by retreating the active manually. What Apom does is completely eliminate this strategy on your opponent's part, since when they start attaching energy, you can just use Tail Code to move it away, and they're back to square one, effectively wasting their whole turn. This is a really tough lock to break from, since the pilot of this deck can adjust their strategy accordingly to how their opponent plays out their turn, while sniping your bench with Yanmega Prime to slowly take those prizes. Talking about speed, this deck is probably one of the slowest I've seen play out. With a 30-minute time limit on Swiss games, it can be tough to come back from a slow start if you don't get that Vileplume out by turn 2 or 3 and don't have proper access to twins during your early turns. This is a very challenging deck to play, and misplays will cost you the vital turns you need to get ahead of that opponent. This is a very challenging deck to play indeed, and misplays will cost you the vital turns you need to stay ahead of the opponent. I would say that this is my favourite version of Vileplume to play, since it is the only one which can really send your opponent into a draw pass game state, making it quite the effective lock. The final version of Vileplume I'm going to cover features one of our new cards from Emerging Powers and is receiving quite the hype, Beartic Vileplume. This deck focuses on getting the Vileplume out along with Beartic in the active spot, using its attack Sheer Cold to lock the opponent's active from attacking, while their outs like Switch are also locked with Vileplume. I'm not sure how well this deck will do in competitive play yet, but it's been getting a massive amount of hype, and here's a basic skeleton for the list so far. Now this list actually has quite a bit of free space, which is probably because of the limited trainers you can include, and there's some space in there for a starter like Cleffa, or even Mantine for Heart Gold Soul Silver as well. I'm not sure what else you should include in here, apart from some extra consistency cards like Max Judge, or even some Copycat in there, and there really isn't much else to say about it, to be honest. It's a pretty basic deck to play, and aims to keep the opponent locked from attacking and retreating until the KO occurs. What I will say about this deck though, is that I don't feel it's going to be a huge asset to the format. I know it will see a fair bit of play because it'll be cheap to build, but I don't think the lock is going to be as easy to put into place than the other two mentioned earlier. The two big main problems I can see so far is Yanmega Prime and Zoroark. Yanmega is the most popular attacker at the moment, and it has free retreat, which makes the lock of Beartic pretty much non-existent, because the opponent can just retreat into another attacker, probably just another Yanmega, and carry on attacking through supporters like Judge and Copycat. However, if you do manage to get the lock on another Pokemon and knock it out, Zoroark could be the next filling the active spot, making for quite the awkward moment. Zoroark's foul play will actually copy your own Sheer Cold and lock you from doing anything. The opponent can end up using your own lock against you to buy some time to build some more attackers, and just keep you in your place with nowhere to go for up to 3 turns. This is probably the biggest downside I see to playing Beartic, and if it does get popular, Zoroark will see a rise in numbers, so I'd either consider teching against it with like a Donphan or something like that, or test against it to outplay it. There will be nothing worse than suffering to your own lock. Overall, this deck is going to be a popular play, but I just can't see how it will stand up to the top tier decks at the moment. It deals well with the likes of Donphan and Magnezone, but I feel an experienced player can just make the lock work for themselves, and either have a way to get out of it, or have a way to use it against you to win out in the end. I would playtest against this though when coming up to Battle Roads, as you will need experience against this kind of deck, as I'm sure it will be a popular play. So that's pretty much all I have for you this week. We've had a good look at how to use Vileplume in 3 different decks to keep the opponent locked down to the fullest in a format that really isn't easy to pull off that kind of strategy. Try building some of the lists I've given you today and see how you fare with them, and see if you could give them a spin for Battle Roads. Thanks for watching today's episode of PokeClass. Make sure you subscribe in the top right hand corner in a second, and I'll see you next week for some more Pokemon trading card game. Thanks for watching.
I